Hello students, this is the video that goes with the lab portion of endocrine organs and tissues. So the organs that we're going to look at are the pituitary or the hypophysis, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal, the pancreas, the testis, and the ovary. Let's look at the hypophysis first. We usually call the hypophysis the pituitary. It has two lobes to it. It has an anterior lobe, which we call the anterior pituitary or the adenohypophysis, and it has a posterior lobe, which is called the neurohypophysis or posterior pituitary. There are several hormones that come from the pituitary. Let's look at the posterior pituitary first. It actually does not produce any hormones of its own, but there are two hormones which are produced in the hypothalamus that are stored and released from here. One is ADH and one is oxytocin. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, makes and releases its own hormones, and there are several. We're only going to look at 6, but there's TSH, FSH, LH, ACTH, and then human growth hormone, or HGH, and prolactin. If you look at the pituitary, this is what it looks like. And it's easy to see that there are these two lobes. Again, let's look at the posterior, or neurohypophysis first. If you look, there are neurons which begin up in the hypothalamus. That's where their cell bodies are. And then they have axons which extend through what's called the infundibulum or pituitary stalk down to the posterior pituitary. So the hormones are made by the cell bodies of these neurons, and they travel down the axons to the posterior pituitary where they're stored. An action potential on these neurons causes the release of the hormone into the bloodstream. Remember, there are two of these, ADH and oxytocin. But if you look at the other picture, the anterior pituitary, look, the neurons up in the hypothalamus don't extend down into the pituitary. They have short axons. They don't go very far. And yet, those neurons are still in control of the anterior pituitary. So what they have to do is they have to release neurohormones called releasing factors, or inhibiting factors, and then those travel down through a special network of blood vessels to the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary does not receive its hormones from the hypothalamus. It makes the hormones, and remember, there's 6 of these. There's TSH, there's FSH, LH, ACTH, human growth hormone, and prolactin. Well, again, we can take a look at this drawing, but to the right is an actual photograph, and so you should be able to easily see the difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary. If you look at the posterior pituitary, again, remember it's just axons, and that's what you see with those little streaky lines in this picture. There are not a lot of cells here. The cells here are just neuroglial cells which aid and protect the neurons. But if you look on the other side, in the left of your picture, where the anterior pituitary is, you see lots and lots and lots of cells. There are none of streaky lines. There are just lots of cells. If we were to blow that up, it would look like this. And so you should be able to, just by looking at it, be able to tell the difference between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. And don't forget, there's this stalk, which is called the infundibulum. Here's another view, and in this case, I'm going to ask you, which one is the anterior and which one is the posterior? Well, again, remember, posterior has streaky lines, and so it is designated by the number 2. Anterior has lots and lots and lots of cells, and so it's designated by the number 1. If you look at the number 3, that's the pituitary stalk, or the infundibulum. So we're going to go through a few pictures of the pituitary. And so what I'd like you to be able to do is pick out the anterior and posterior pituitary. In this picture, again, remember what we're going to look for, lots of cells or just streaky lines. So in this picture, the anterior is on the left, the posterior is on the right. See if you can figure out which one this is. The anterior is on the left, the posterior is on the right. Here's another one. This time the anterior is on the right and the posterior is on the left. Look at this one again. So hopefully by now you can figure that out. Let's look at another pair of endocrine glands. One is the thyroid, and then again in a little bit we'll look at the parathyroid. So the thyroid gland makes two hormones. One of them is called thyroxine, or we designate it, or I designate it, T3, T4, and that's usually what I'm going to call it. The other one, which is a completely different hormone, is called calcitonin. Since there are two hormones that come from the thyroid, what we're going to see that there are two types of cells, and each type of cell is going to produce a hormone. So this is what the thyroid looks like. It's sort of a butterfly-shaped gland in your neck. It hangs down and wraps around where your Adam's apple is. You can sort of feel it if you put your hand up there and feel around. And this is one of the things a doctor might do when you go to have an exam. Attached to the thyroid, posterior to it, are the parathyroids. And you can see the parathyroid in this picture. Look, it looks completely different than the rest of the slide. So let's ignore the parathyroid for now and just look at the thyroid. So the thyroid is made up of a bunch of tiny little sacs. The sacs are called follicles. And if you look at them, you can see the follicles is a circle of cells with this smooth purple material inside. A good way to think about these follicles is to think about a balloon that you filled up with water, and then you froze it in a freezer, and then you took a saw or a knife and cut it in half. You looked at that cut edge. What you see is the balloon, those are the cells, and the ice, that's that clear purple material, which is called colloid. So these cells are cells of the follicle, so they're called follicular cells. And follicular cells are the ones that make T3, T4. But even in this picture, if you look, some places we don't see those circles. You just see a clump of cells that are not part of a circle. These are not follicular cells. They're next to follicular cells, and so they're called parafollicular cells, and those are the cells that make calcitonin. So what you need to do when you look at these slides, and there's a couple of them, is first pick out the follicles, pick out the follicular cells, and then pick out the cells that are not part of a follicle, pick out the parafollicular cells. So if we blow it way up, you can see these follicles and the colloid in the middle. And then you can see these cells. Now in this picture, they're labeled principal cells, but we're just going to call them follicular cells. So if they're part of a circle surrounding the colloid, they are follicular cells. But these that I have put these yellow circles around, they're not part of a follicle. And so those are the parafollicular cells. Here's another picture. This one's not labeled for you, but hopefully you can, by now, you can easily pick out the follicles. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 12 follicles here. Each one, remember, is like a balloon filled up with water, frozen, cut in half. Those are the follicular cells. But these that are inside these yellow circles are not part of a follicle. And look, they don't even look the same. They're paler and larger. These are the parafollicular cells. If we blow it up even more, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 follicles. So I see the follicular cells, and then I see inside this yellow circle the parafollicular cells. You try to do it here, even though it's labeled. Ignore the labels and see if you can figure it out. So that was the thyroid. Well, remember the thyroid is this butterfly-shaped gland in your neck. Well, on the posterior side of the thyroid are 4 to 8 little glands called the parathyroids. So the parathyroids are completely different glands, and they don't have anything to do with the thyroid. They're just embedded in it. So when we looked at that slide, we saw this circular mass that was completely different. That is our parathyroid. The parathyroid makes a single hormone, and it's just called parathyroid hormone, or PTH. So if we look at that slide, here it is again. Now let's ignore the thyroid. You see this round, dense-looking structure? That's the parathyroid. But look inside this picture. It's filled with cells, but there's 2 types of cells in here, some that are smaller and darker, and then every so often you'll see cells that are larger and pale. So there are 2 types of cells in the parathyroid. The 2 types of cells, kind of hard to see in this picture, are the ones that are associated with the parathyroid. But we can also have adipose cells in the parathyroid, and they tend to get more and more as you get older and older. And so when you look in this and you see these cells that look like clear, sort of chicken wire looking cells, those are adipose cells. They have no function in the parathyroid. But let's take another look at the parathyroid. So we can see these dark cells. They're called principal cells. So principal cells are smaller and denser looking, darker looking. But every so often you see these much larger cells that are paler. These are called oxyphil cells. And I put a few inside these yellow circles. Not the only ones, though. See if you can pick out some that are not in one of the yellow circles. They're scattered around. Those are oxyphil cells. Well, oxyphil cells, we don't know what the function is. Most researchers, most people think that they're resting cells. The principal cells are the ones that make the hormone. And remember, there's only one hormone that comes from the parathyroid, PTH. So here's another view of the parathyroid. Here are these dense cells. Now in this picture, they're labeled chief cells. That's okay too, but usually they're called principal cells. And then these larger, paler cells are the oxyphil cells. Let's look at another gland. This is the adrenal gland. So adrenal glands set right on top of the kidneys. They're like little triangular hats on top of the kidneys. Because they're on top of the kidneys, sometimes they're called suprarenal glands. And the artery and vein, which you can see in this picture, are actually called suprarenal arteries. Now, eventually, they're probably going to wind up with the same name. But for now, the gland is called the adrenal. The blood vessels are called suprarenal. But to use either one of those is probably not incorrect. The adrenal gland, though, is sort of like the pituitary because it's basically 2 separate glands that are sitting right next to each other. One gland in the middle is called the adrenal medulla. Medulla means middle. There's a gland around that on the outside, which is called the adrenal cortex. Cortex means rind, like a watermelon rind or an orange rind, and it's on the outside. The adrenal medulla, the center part, makes 2 hormones, and you probably have heard of these hormones, at least one of them. One of them is epinephrine, or epi, and the other one is norepinephrine, or norepi. Now, epinephrine is also called adrenaline, from the word adrenal, and norepi is also called noradrenaline, again from the word adrenal. Adrenaline and noradrenaline are used mostly in places like the UK. Here, we use epi and norepi. The cortex, the outer part, is actually divided up into 3 zones. The zones, each one produces a different class of hormones with a major hormone. So there's one class, one zone, called the zona glomerulosa. The word glomerulosa means little balls. So this is the zone of little balls. And the reason it's called that is because the cells are clumped together in little balls. The main hormone that comes from this is aldosterone. There's a middle zone called the zona fasciculata. Fasciculata means cords. So this is the zone of cords or ropes, because the cells here are arranged in straight lines like a rope. The primary hormone that comes from here is called cortisol. And then the innermost layer is called the zona reticulosa. Reticulosa and the word reticulum together mean the same thing, and they mean network, like a net, like a fish net, or a spider web, something that looks like a net. And the reason it's called that is because that's how the cells are arranged. This zone makes a class of hormones very, very similar to testosterone. They're called androgens. And andro means male, gen means to create, so they're male creating hormones or male sex hormones. So we're going to see both glands, the medulla and the cortex. We're going to see the zones inside the cortex. So if we look at this picture, look to the left, this is the drawing. Remember, it sits on top of the kidney, and it's like a little triangular hat. And here you can see the 2 glands very easily. So there's an outside layer, which is not it. That's called the capsule. And then there's this rind layer, that's the cortex. And then there's this center layer, that's the medulla. And if you look into the picture to the right, again, you can see the capsule, very thin layer. It's just a protective layer. And you can see the cortex, which has dense number of cells. And then the medulla, which has many fewer cells, and also there are blood vessels in here. And you can see these little clumps of red dots. Those are blood cells. So let's blow it up and look at it. So if we look here to the outside edge, that's the capsule. And then we have the adrenal cortex. Remember, it goes all the way around like a rind. And then there's the medulla in the middle with blood vessels in there. There's another view, and this one's labeled. So the outside, which isn't labeled, that's the cortex. And then we can see zones in here. And even without knowing the names of the zones, you should be able to pick them out. So remember, the very center is the medulla. Excuse me. It doesn't have any zones. But the cortex has 3 zones. The one right next to the capsule is the glomerulosa, the zone of little balls. The one in the middle is the zona fasciculata, the zone of little cords. And then the one closest to the medulla is the zona reticulata, which is the zone of a network. So an easy way to remember this is just remember the initials, GFR and then M. Let's blow it up even more and look at it. So there's our capsule. There's our zona glomerulosa, the zone of little balls. There's the zona fasciculata, the zone of columns, and the zona reticularis, and then finally the medulla. Again, there's our capsule. That isn't part of the gland. It's just a protective layer. The zone of little balls, you can see them. The zone of cords, the zone of the network, and in the center, which sort of looks like little pie shapes, that's the adrenal medulla. See if you can pick these out. So there's a black and white picture with the zones not labeled, but showing you the zones. And then you can see the color picture with the zones. Here's another picture. You should be able by now to name the zones. So first there's a capsule, then the zona glomerulosa, then the zona fasciculata, and then the zona reticularis, and then the medulla. See if you can do it on here. Now they're labeled with letters, but even without the letters, you can see different zones. Now you may not be able to see the little balls or the cords, but if you learn them in order from the capsule to the medulla, it's not very difficult to do. Let's look at another gland. This is called the pancreas. So the pancreas is part of two systems. It's part of the endocrine system, which we're studying now, but it's also a major organ of the digestive system. So it has two different jobs. For the digestive system, it makes digestive enzymes and bicarbonate. It's very, very important for digestion. But it is also important as an endocrine organ because it makes the hormones insulin and glucagon. The two hormones, insulin and glucagon, are both hormones that help regulate blood sugar. These are antagonistic, which means they have opposite effects. Insulin lowers blood glucose, glucagon raises blood glucose. They're both produced in a little area called an islet. So if you look at this, this is a slice of the pancreas. Most of what you see here are the tiny little glands that make digestive enzymes. These are called acini, or acinar glands, if you remember that from A&P1. Remember, acinar means that they're shaped like little tiny flasks. They have a duct. They make the digestive enzymes. The digestive enzymes travel through the duct and then bigger ducts and bigger ducts until it gets into the small intestine. Scattered around in here, though, are endocrine patches. They look like little islands, and so they're called pancreatic islets. Now, a lot of times they're called islets of Langerhans. Langerhans was a scientist that described a lot of things in the body, and so that name is pretty common in the body. But we're trying to get away from things named after people, and so soon they're just going to be called pancreatic islets. But look, they don't look anything like those other glands. They're these patches. They're different color. They don't have this acinar shape. They don't even have ducts. See if you can pick out the islet. So number 1 is those acinar glands. Number 4 is one of those ducts we saw, a bigger one. And then number 2 is this islet. Hopefully here you can pick out the islet. Let's look at another gland. This is the testis. So the testis, or testes, are male reproductive glands. So just like the pancreas, they sort of are part of two systems. They're part of the reproductive system because they make the sperm, the male gamete, but they're also part of the endocrine system because they make hormones. The primary hormone that's made here is called testosterone. But when we take a slice through the testis, we're going to see the organs that make this sperm, and we're going to see the cells that make the hormone. Again, that hormone primarily is testosterone. So here is a slice through an entire testis. And look, what you see are lots and lots of little channels. These channels are actually tiny little walls. They're called septa. And they separate the testis into little compartments. And within each compartment or lobe is this network of tubes, tiny, tiny, tiny little tubules. They're coiled, they're twisted. This is where the sperm are made. If we blow this up, you can see each of those little tubes. They're hollow in the middle. Now, the reason they're shaped in lots of different shapes is because they're twisted inside the testis. And so when you make a section, some are going to be cross sections, some are going to be oblique sections, some are going to be longitudinal sections. See if you can pick out those three types of sections. You should remember this from A&P 1, the first day of lab. Well, these again are the places where sperm are made. But if you look closely, you can see patches of tissue in between the tubes. In between the tubes. Those patches of tissue, which are called interstitial cells, are where the hormone is made. So if we blow this up, there's our seminiferous tubule, the tubule where the sperm are made. And I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seminiferous tubules. If you look, the sperm are made and they travel from the outside of the tube toward the center of the tube. And as they do that, they proceed with their development. And when they're completely developed, they're released into the hollow space in the middle. But remember, between the seminiferous tubules are these patches of tissue called interstitial cells. That's where the hormones are made. So we blow it up even more. Well, not so much more. But here you can see the patches, and I have little yellow circles around them. Those are the interstitial cells, sometimes called interstitial cells of Leydig or even Leydig cells. Let's blow that up. So here, much bigger, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 seminiferous tubules. And then you can see these patches in between. And I have these dotted lines around the patches. Those are the interstitial cells of Leydig. Here is an even larger blow up. And then you can see around inside this yellow dotted line, those are the interstitial cells. So that's the testis. The last one we're going to look at is the ovary. So just like the testis, the ovary has two jobs and is part of two different systems. It's part of the reproductive system because that's where the ova or eggs of the female, the gametes of the female, are made. But just like the testis, it's also part of the endocrine system because it makes hormones of the female. And there are several of these hormones. The only one we're really going to talk about is estrogen, but another important hormone is progesterone. So let's take a look at the ovary. So here's an entire ovary cut in half, and you can see two different things going on here. Let's look at the outside, very outside layer. There's a capsule, just like we have around most organs. That does not participate in anything. It's just there as a protective capsule. If you look in the center of this, you'll see something called the medulla. The medulla has basically sort of an internal skeleton or stroma, and then it also has blood vessels in there. It also does not participate. It's just supportive. But there's a layer just beneath the capsule, exterior to the medulla, which again is called a cortex. And if you look in the cortex, what you're going to see are developing eggs. Now, eggs are called oocytes. So we're going to see developing oocytes. Oocytes are the very largest cells in the human body. They are the only cells that you can see with your naked eye. They're about the size, if you take a very, very sharp pencil and make a dot on a piece of paper with that sharp pencil, that's about how big they are. That's about 1,000 times bigger than most cells. But they develop inside something similar to what we have in the thyroid, little sacs or follicles. And so what you see inside these yellow circles is you see a follicle with lots of cells. And then in the very center, you see a sort of a hollow space. And then there's an oocyte in the center of that. Now, unlike males, females only generally release one oocyte per cycle, per 28-day cycle. And so what we see are various levels of development. But let's blow up one and look at it. So again, inside these yellow circles, we're going to see the follicle. In the very center of the follicle, we're going to see a hollow space, and then this large cell, remember it's the largest cell in the human body, the oocyte. Here's another one, and we can see it. And so there's our follicle. Well, the follicle has lots of cells, and the follicle cells are called granulosa cells. And these granulosa cells are the cells that produce the estrogen. In the center, we see the oocyte. That is the future egg. Now, if you look at this picture, you'll see smaller follicles. These are not developed yet. This one's fairly large, but it gets even bigger. And so during that 28-day cycle, it takes about 14 days to produce an oocyte ready to be ovulated. That oocyte and that follicle look like this. They're huge. They're like a little blister on the surface of the ovary. And so if you look in the very center, you see that huge cell. That's the oocyte. We're going to see cells around it. They're called the corona radiata. These are also granulosa cells. And then they're going to see hollow space, which has fluid in it, and then more granulosa cells. So remember, these granulosa cells, sometimes called follicular cells, are the cells that produce the hormone. So that's the end of the lab for endocrine.